Alright lads, welcome to my War Thunder Tank Premium Guide. This is going to be a very straightforward video, not much editing. It's also purely going to be on my own feelings towards these premium vehicles. Some other content creators might have different opinions and that's totally fine. Some of the premiums I cover may no longer be available to purchase, but with the upcoming 10th anniversary of the War Thunder, Gaijin may bring back some of these vehicles, so I may as well include them. One last thing, if you hear the mouse clicks in the background, I do apologise, but there's not much I can do about it. Anyway, our first premium vehicle is the M2A4. It's a beginner premium, it only costs 250 Golden Eagles. There's not really any point buying a tier 1 premium to be honest, for actually grinding. So you should only really buy a tier 1 premium if you just want to have some fun. The M8 LAC used to be a reward I believe quite a while ago. It used to be incredibly overpowered at battle rating 1.0. Mainly due to this 50 caliber machine gun, because it can penetrate pretty much all of the armor at BR 1.0. But I don't have it, it's quite expensive on the marketplace I believe. After the M8 we also have the M3A1, it's a Stuart variant. I believe this is from the United States Marine Corps. I think it has some sort of decals on it. Oh, it's got a unique camouflage, pretty cool. Again at battle rating 2.3 it does have a nice place in the 2.7 meta lineup in the American tech tree. Quite a good lineup. But again, it's rank 1. It's not really that useful for grinding out the American tech tree past rank 2. So I can't really recommend people buy them. We then have the M8A1. Again, this used to be a reward vehicle. You see there the Winter Holidays 2014/2015. Again, this tank used to be incredibly expensive on the Gaijin marketplace. But seeing as it was added as a tech tree vehicle in the Chinese tech tree, if I can find it somewhere, or maybe they didn't. Anyway, it has dropped down in price significantly. It's no longer as expensive as it was and it is a lot of fun. You can see here that it is an M8A1 Scout thing, but it has the 75mm cannon found on the Shermans. Got some nice cancer bushes here. See that we do get the M61 nuke round that's found on all of the early Sherman tanks, giving you the same firepower as a Sherman at battle rating 2.7. Again, it fits very nicely into the 2.7 lineup. We then move on to rank 2, and starting with another Stuart. Again, this is 2.7, pretty much the same as the M3A4, just a few minor differences. Again, it is battle rating 2.7, so it does fit into that nice lineup. You got a little bit better grinding potential because it is rank 2, so you can grind all the way up to the late Shermans with it if you really wanted to. It is nice to grind out battle rating 5.3 with a 2.7. But in terms of value for money, it's not great to be honest. No one's going out and buying this saying it's overpowered. I'm not even sure if you can actually still buy it. But it is a nice bit of fun if you can pick it up in the future. But not an absolute necessity. We then have the LVT A4. Again, this used to be a very expensive vehicle before it was added to the Chinese tech tree as a tech tree vehicle. This obviously isn't a premium, but it is an event vehicle which was rare. It's not so much anymore. I wouldn't really recommend getting this at all really, it's not as powerful as it used to be. We then have the Grant. I think this was a British vehicle, I'm not too sure why it's in the American tech tree. But again, it's battle rating 2.7 with a fairly powerful 75mm cannon. You also have the 37mm gun found on the Stuarts. Overall, it's a pretty nice tank. I don't personally own it because I think my 2.7 is already buffed out enough. But for the price of 1000 Golden Eagles, it's not a terribly expensive purchase. We then have the T18E2 Boarhound. This was another reward premium for the 2018 crafting event. This is one of the better premiums I believe. I do not personally have this because I couldn't be bothered getting it. It's got a rather unique 57mm cannon, giving it fairly decent firepower. It's also fairly mobile, but it isn't very manoeuvrable due to its 8x8 chassis. Overall, it's a pretty nice meme vehicle. Battle rating 3.0, it doesn't really have a lineup, you kind of have to up tier it or take it in a single lineup. So it's not the best in that respect. But it's a nice little premium, and if you're a collector out there and they do put it back up for sale, I'd definitely recommend getting it. We then come on to the M4A5, this is the Canadian Ram tank. It was very unique when it was first introduced because it does have a very high penetration APC-BC round. Doesn't have any high explosive filler obviously because it is a British vehicle, but it did used to have a lot of penetration. especially compared to the M4s, which only have around 100mm. This has 120. So it used to be quite overpowered. I do also believe it has a short stabilizer. Yeah, vertical stabilizer. So it was very good back in the day. It's not as good as it used to be, but it does fit very well into a 3.7 lineup. Although you are quite limited with just the M4 and the M24 chassis. Alright, moving up to rank 3. I'm going to start with the big boy itself, the T14 heavy tank. This thing used to be insanely overpowered, but they did increase its battle rating a few years ago. So now it's 4.7. You will fight battle rating 5.3 Germany quite a lot. The armour isn't as good as it used to be. You can see here that the turret is around 6 inches thick in places, which does give it pretty good protection from the front at least. But the hull is actually the weak spot really, especially the side of the hull. While it is hard for enemies to go through, you can see here the lower frontal plate is only 4 inches thick. So for the 88mm and 75mm long barrel cannons in the 5.3 German lineup, it's not really a match for it anymore. If you're in a down tier, of course it is going to be incredibly good, but you can't really rely on that. We then have the T55E1. This thing was pretty broken when it was first introduced last year or so. I don't really see this thing coming back anytime soon. It's got a very low profile, 76mm gun of the late war Shermans. Pretty decent penetration. It's nowhere near as good as it used to be. They have increased its battle rating slightly. It's incredibly fast. It can flank around the battlefield very quickly. But again, because it is battle rating 4.3, you will face the 5.3 German lineup pretty frequently. Moving onwards, we have the Cobra King, one of the oldest premiums in War Thunder. This is basically an M4 Jumbo, and that is pretty much it, to be honest. It's got the same gun as found on the early Shermans with the M61. As we covered in the M8A1 at battle rating 2.7, this is the same gun at 5.3. So in terms of its gun performance, it certainly is quite lacking, especially when you're going up against Tigers and Panthers every game. You are going to struggle to penetrate their armour. But the trade-off for that is you do have very thick armour yourself. If we take a quicker look again, see that we have 2 plates here. One is 1.5 inches thick, the other is 2.5 inches thick. So you have 4 inches of combined thickness. It is going to bounce quite a lot of rounds. You do have a weak spot with your machine gun port. The turret is pretty much a no penetration at all, especially with a battle rating 5.3. It's a decent premium, but I wouldn't really say it's good for the more experienced players. You are limited by your gun performance. If you're new to War Thunder and you need to rely on your armour to keep yourself alive, then it may be a good premium. At battle rating 5.3, you don't really have the world's best lineup though. You only have the other Sherman, the other Jumbo, sorry. You do have the 76 Sherman as well, but it's not that good. You are going to find yourself getting up tier to 5.7 a lot of the time. It's alright. Good old Cobra King. We then have the M18 Black Cat. Again, this is a very old premium and used to be overpowered. Back in the days where pretty much the Tiger tank was the top tier vehicle in the German tech tree, M18s and Tigers were frequently fighting each other. The M18 were considered overpowered at one point because they were so fast. Again, that was 1 or 2 years after they actually introduced tanks into War Thunder, so a very long time ago. The M18 Hellcat though is still as good as it used to be. It's very fast. It's got a very powerful gun. Pretty good post penetration damage as well with that M62 round. 6 inches of penetration pretty much. And because you're so fast, you can flank the battlefield very effectively. The only difference between this thing and the tech tree M18 is that you do not have a muzzle brake, I believe. The premium one just doesn't have a muzzle brake for some reason. Who knows why. Also got a new camouflage scheme, but no one really cares about that. Then move on to the T20. Again, this did used to be a very good premium. It used to have a 2-plane gun stabilizer, I believe, but I think they have removed this now. And they do have a single plane stabilizer. They definitely changed something to it recently. I think they may have nerfed it significantly. It's nowhere near as good as it used to be in my opinion. You do have that pretty decent firepower though. You got the same penetration gun as the M18 Hellcat. But I wouldn't really recommend this tank anymore, especially being so close to rank 4 when we've got all these bad boys, but we'll come on to them shortly. But first, let's cover the meme vehicle itself, probably the biggest waste of money in War Thunder, the Calliope. This thing basically has a shitload of 4.5 inch M8 rockets on it. pretty good in enlisted against infantry, not so good in War Thunder against enemy tanks. This is basically just a bog standard Sherman tank. It's got the same 75mm gun. While it does fit very well into a 4.0 lineup with the other M4A2 and the M19A1, it isn't the world's biggest lineup, and you are going to find yourself up tier to 4.7 quite a lot. The rockets are a complete meme and just serve as a massive ammo rack which will get you killed if an enemy shoots a high explosive here. So I can't really recommend it. It's one of the biggest meme vehicles in War Thunder. I think I bought it because I had a 75% off token and thought, may as well do it, Anta. It's only, I think this is like nearly 10,000 G or something stupid like that. Definitely not worth that. Don't buy it for that money if it's on a sale for like 75% off. It's a pretty good meme vehicle if you play it, but if you are going to spend money just for grinding, I would not recommend this at all. Moving into rank 4, and we'll start with the Super Hellcat. This has the same 90mm gun that's found on the Pershing, but at battle rating 6.3, this tank isn't as fast as it was at 5.3, or 5.7 sorry, so its performance isn't as good as the earlier M18. The performance of this gun isn't that much different than the 5.7 gun either, so you're paying a lot of money for pretty much the same performance. The speed difference between these two, I believe this is actually slightly heavier, so it's not actually as nimble as this thing. So I'd give this tank a miss. The T28 is the smaller brother of the T95. While it does have quite thick armour, it's got quite flat sides which kind of negates this. It's nowhere near as good as the actual T95 itself. So I wouldn't really recommend this. Again, for 7,500 Golden Eagles, there are a lot better options available. It does have a very powerful gun. I believe it's the same gun found on the T29. Again, we'll come on to that shortly. Actually, this might be a slightly different gun. Anyway, we may as well go on to the T29 next. Is it the same? Yes, it is the same gun. So if you are thinking about getting this because you think it's got a great gun, I'd just recommend getting this thing. The T29 is what I grinded out the majority of the American tech tree with. You can get a nice camouflage for it here. I do believe this is quite expensive now. But if you've ever played World of Tanks, that cursed game that we shouldn't talk about, you know that it has got a lot of armour. I believe this is 8 inches thick. Yeah, that's 8 inches thick here, the gun mantlet. The hull isn't the best, it's only 4 inches thick. But it is surprisingly bouncy, especially if you're shooting into the tracks, it can eat them quite a lot. It's a very good tank, it's quite a big profile, but it's surprisingly maneuverable. If you just go into the 7.0 lineup here, this is my pay to win lineup. You take a look at the reload speed. So it can get down to a 12 second or 12.5 second reload speed. It's not the best, especially considering the Tiger 2s fire every 8 seconds, I believe. But it is a 105mm gun with an absolute nuke round, the T13. 250mm of pen with nearly 200 grams of TNT. You can't really go wrong in my opinion. I believe it's only $30, so if you can get that for half price or 30% off, it's an absolute bargain. We then have the M26 T99. This is basically the Calliope's bigger brother really. It's basically an M26 Pershing tank fitted with more explosive rocket things. These are the same 4.5 inch M8 rockets. Same as the Calliope, but it's not as bad. You don't obviously have a massive thing up here telling everyone that you're coming over a hill. It's a little bit more low profile, but the rockets being at a higher battle rating, 6.3 instead of 4.0, the rockets are even more useless. While you can use them to overpressure the lighter vehicles in game, it's a very niche application in my opinion, and I don't really think it's worth it. While you do have pretty decent firepower, I believe, although not the best. The M26 was never considered a good tank. The 90mm was a little bit underwhelming. I think the army were disappointed with it in real life, but I can't really recommend getting it. It's not worth the money in my opinion, and I still think this is ridiculously a lot of Golden Eagles to get. Moving on to the M26E1, this used to be one of my favourite vehicles in the game. It's basically an M26 Pershing fitted with a long-barreled 90mm gun. Because of this long-barreled gun, it has a lot more penetration, nearly 9 inches of pen, with pretty decent post-penetration damage, 140 grams of TNT. The only downside of this though, again if we go into the reload speed, if I can find it, is it in this lineup? Yes, it's there. It's evading me. Bloody hell, wrong button. We go into the crew, we can see the reload speed. It can get down to 11.1 seconds, but that is significantly slower than a lot of other medium tanks at the battle rating. So you basically have medium tank armor and mobility, but with a heavy tank firepower. It's a pretty good vehicle, but it is let down by its reload speed a bit. You kind of have to play it as a heavy tank, as I said, but if that's something you like and you can get it for cheap, it's a decent vehicle. But if you can afford to buy the T29, I'd get that instead of this any day. We then have the T30, the absolute meme machine. I remember when this was on the Guardian marketplace for 15 Guardian coins, now it's like something stupid. It's basically got the M107 high explosive shell, which gives you 54mm of penetration. You can basically kill anything with one hit of this thing. It's kind of like the American version of the G6, or the Soviet, whatever it's called. This thing. It's basically a high explosive shell that does an absolute shit ton of damage. It's fairly expensive to buy now. I doubt they're going to bring it back for wide-scale purchase other than the Gaijin store. But if you can ever get this thing for cheap, it is a pretty good tank. As you probably saw in the customization section, it is basically a T29 chassis with a different turret and a different gun. The American army were basically doing different tests with different guns, and that is why there's so many different tanks. It's also how we get the T34 in the actual tech tree. This was, I believe, the main variant they did with a 120mm, is it? Anyway, getting sidetracked. Let's go back to probably one of the best tanks to pick up in the rank 4 tech tree of the Americans, the M46 Tiger. The reason the M46 is so good is mainly due to its high explosive anti-tank shell. It basically only has a shorter 90mm gun, but because of that high explosive anti-tank, it doesn't really matter. This tank isn't really known for its kinetic energy penetrators, but that heat shell means it doesn't really matter. Got 305mm of penetration, with pretty decent post-penetration damage. You still do get the M82 shell, so if you get the side of an enemy you can kill them, you can nuke them basically, the M82 nuke shell. It's a pretty decent tank. It does come with a unique camouflage, I believe. I think I took it off. Yeah, you get that thing. Pretty decent tank. It's a toss-up really between the T29 and the M46. As you can see here, I have them both. But I used to play this battle rating a lot, especially if you can get this thing, the A2D. Very, very strong lineup at 7.0. And finally for the Americans, we have the M6A2E1. This was available last year, I believe, in the Battle Pass. I don't really see it being that useful. It's incredibly tall. It's not particularly armoured, especially at 6.7 when you've got a heat FS firing at you from every angle. It just sticks out like a sore thumb in my opinion, and I don't really see a point in it. Alright lads, welcome to rank 5, quite a small one. We've only got a few left actually. We also have the T114. I think this has quite a few nice camouflages actually. Got a nice face on it. This is basically a RPG firer basically. It's a recoilless rifle that fires the M344A1. 433mm of penetration with 1.65 kilos of TNT filler. Gives it pretty good post-pen damage. The only problem is you only have a first stage ammunition rack of 3 shells. And it reloads very quickly, so you fire 3 and it takes quite a long time to reload them. This tank used to be incredibly powerful. It actually used to be battle rating 7.0, so it used to fit into the tier 4 lineup very, very well. But they have up-tiered it to 7.3 now, which has reduced its effectiveness in my opinion. It just doesn't really have a lineup. America goes from 7.0 to 7.7 really, so they have kind of made it a little less good in my opinion. We then also have the Magak. I do not believe that you were able to be... I don't think you'll be able to purchase this tank again in the American tech tree. I think it is now in the Swedish tech tree here, the Magak 3. This used to be pretty decent at 7.7. It doesn't have a gun stabilizer though, so you do kind of get shit on by the British players. It has pretty decent ERA. I also believe it has a decent high explosive anti-tank shell, yeah, 400mm of penetration. It's pretty decent. I believe it also has a rangefinder, which does help quite a lot. But it's not the best thing in the world, and as I said, I don't think you'll be able to get this anyway. We then have the T54E1. This has an oscillating turret. and an autoloader. I believe it reloads every 5 seconds. Yeah. So you have a 9 round ready rack with a 5-second reload. It's pretty powerful. This is classed as a heavy tank, I believe. Doesn't really have heavy tank armor. Can bounce quite a lot with your hull. Your hull does bounce quite a lot of incoming shots if you get lucky though. The turret is a bit troll because it's got so many different angles, so with volumetric it is kind of trolly, but can't really bet on it. Just like the Magak, what we're going into here. Just like the Magak, it does have a pretty decent high explosive anti-tank shell. Not as good as the Magak, mind you. We do also have an APDS round as well if you do want to fire that. I don't really think this is worth it at 8.0. I think it's around $50, and if you can afford that, you may as well get our next tank, the XM1. The XM1 is one of the oldest premiums in War Thunder actually. It was one of the first premiums to get thermal imaging as well. For people who don't know, you can tell that this is a thermal imaging equipped tank because the NVD has a white background. If we go into the Merkava Mark 1 for example, you can see that this is a green background, signifying that it only has night vision, not thermal. The XM1 though, it is a pretty decent tank. It's not really got any armor to speak of. I think it has spaced armor instead of actual oh, it does have composite. Oh well. Oh, it's got spaced armor in the hull and composite in the cheeks, which is pretty decent to be honest. The only thing is it only has a pretty shitty APFSDS round, the M735. Doesn't really create much spalling, and it's got decent penetration but not really good against angled armor. So this APDS does kind of let you down a little bit. Famously, the XM1 does not get smoke grenades, which does kind of let it down on the battlefield a little bit. It's not a major downside in my opinion though. You do have a nice 50 cal as well. I think America is probably going to get a new battle rating 9.7 or 10.0 premium in the future. Every other nation seems to have got one, seeing as not the Japanese, because they're still stuck with the shitty Type 74. The British have got the Challenger, the Soviets have got the Terms. So I think the XM1 will get an update in the future, but it does seem to still be selling well. It's very, very fast. The gun is kind of mediocre, and the armor is a little bit non-existent to be honest. The main strength of this tank is definitely the mobility though. It can zip around the battlefield and generally gets in places you don't expect it. The gun, as I said, is a little bit of a letdown, but it can still get the job done, especially at 9.7. 10.0 it starts getting a little bit sketchy, but you can still make it work. Alright, onto the German tech tree, starting with the Panzer II-C DAK. This is basically a bog standard Panzer II-C. It's got the same stuff as the tech tree one. Pretty nice vehicle if you want to get a little bit of bonus XP and Silver Lions, but not really something you should run out and buy. I believe it is only 250 Golden Eagles, so pretty cheap, but not exactly going to be grinding the entire tech tree with it. We then have this thing, the 251/10, not even going to try and pronounce a German name. It's basically a shitty little 37mm gun on a, well, tracked little car thing. I don't even know what they're called anymore. It's not worth it, that's the short thing. This was actually an event vehicle, so I doubt they'll actually bring this back. But even so, it's not really worth it. We then have this thing, Afklärungspanzer. That's what I'm going to guess. Afklärungspanzer, yeah. Whatever this is, it's basically a 20mm gun on top of a Panzer 38T. It's a pretty nice little tank, especially when it was first introduced. I believe it does get the pretty decent Panzer Grenade, yeah. Pretty good round, 50mm of penetration at 1.3, can't really complain with it. I believe this is sold for about £10 or $10 or euros in like a pack or something. Pretty good to pick up if you can get it. But again, it's a rank 1 premium, it's not really going to be grinding out past rank 2. Good bit of fun, not really that useful. We then have the Flak Puma. This is exactly what it sounds like. It is a Puma hull with a 20mm gun in it. Again, like the last vehicle, it's basically got that really good Panzergranat 40 round. Pretty decent penetration at a low battle rating. It is slightly higher than this thing, it's 1.7, which does kind of push up its effectiveness a little. Well, it pushes down its effectiveness. 1.3 lineup with these two is pretty decent. Wouldn't really recommend up tiering it to 1.7 though. Can't really recommend this. It was a pretty good vehicle at the time, but they have put it up significantly. We then have this thing, the whatever it's called. It's not worth it. It's got a very low muzzle velocity 75mm gun, same as in the Panzer IV, I believe. It's not really worth it at all. I've never picked it up because I don't really see the point of it. It's fairly expensive for a rank 1 premium and it's not really that effective. We then have the howitzer Puma type thing. It's got the very early 75mm gun found in the Panzer IV as well, I believe. Pretty decent high explosive anti-tank shell, 100mm of penetration. The APC BC round isn't very good though, only 52mm of penetration. So it is pretty effective with its high explosive anti-tank. It's basically the baby version of the Pack Puma down here, but we'll get to that shortly. We then move on to the Panzer IIIN. Again, like the last tank we covered, it also has a short-barreled 75mm gun. Basically a, well, it's not a howitzer, is it? They were originally designed as anti-personnel guns, really, firing high explosive rounds. Again, pretty decent high explosive anti-tank shell, pretty good post-penetration damage. It is fairly mobile, being a Panzer IIIN chassis. It's a lot better protected than this thing. So it is quite a bit of fun, really. I have it in my 3.3 lineup, which is pretty effective. You get to take out this thing with a massive 2.5 ton bomb. I also get to take out the Panzer IIIM and the Panzer III. I don't have the Panzer IIIN with me. But at battle rating 3.0, it is fairly effective. You can also take it out with this thing, the 251/22. This is basically the Pack Puma's slower brother. It's basically a 75mm L46 on one of these things. I can't remember what these are called. Let me know down below. They do have a weird name. Is it here? No. Is it Hasselback? Hasselback? Something like that? I don't know. Anyway, this thing was an event vehicle. No, it wasn't. It was in the battle pass, sorry. It's pretty decent. Got a good penetration gun. Same as the Panzer IV 75mm long barrels. So I can't really complain about that. The battle rating 3.0 is fairly decent, but they're probably not going to bring this back, to be honest, lads. So it's a shame, but it is a nice vehicle. We then have the Nebelwerfer. Again, it can overpressure fairly well, 27mm of penetration with a high explosive round. It's not amazing, to be honest, but it can get the job done. We have 20 rounds of high explosive rockets, but we have a first stage ready rack of 10 rounds. It's not really effective. If you've played it unlisted, then it is quite effective in that game, but in War Thunder, it's pretty bad. And finally, for rank 2, we have the T-34-747. Again, this is a very good premium. It used to be probably overpowered, to be honest. It used to be battle rating 4.0, but then they increased it to 4.3. Again, another pretty easy pay to win lineup for the German tech tree. Where is it? It's over here somewhere. This thing is pretty decent. It's got add-on armor here, so we have 15mm thick plate added on top of the 45mm plate. So you do have additional armor compared to a normal T-34. You do only get the very early rounds though, so it is a little bit let down. Kind of like the T-14 in the American tech tree. It's got pretty decent armor, but a pretty lackluster gun. So it's kind of trading off. It's got good mobility and good armor, but a pretty bad cannon. But in this lineup at 4.3, it is very effective. Pretty good for grounding, despite only being rank 2. So you can't reuse it for events, which is a bit of a pain in the ass. But if you just want to have some fun, grind out rank 3, then it's a pretty decent little premium. We then move on to the KV2, which is called the KW2 for some reason in the German tech tree, sorry. The KV2 is seeing a resurgence right now with the overpressure changes in the last couple of years. So it is actually pretty effective. You still only have the terrible reload speed of like 30 seconds though. So for pure grinding, it's not the best because you can't really get that points per minute down. But it's a pretty decent investment if you want to have a bit of fun. 3.7 lineup, it's not really that common. Like the 3.7 German lineup isn't really well known. I suppose you can take out some of the Panzer IVs, but you're better either sticking with 3.3 or 4.3. Then move on to the Pack Puma. This is almost certainly not going to be available for sale again. It is available for sale on the Gaijin marketplace, where it's around 1,000 golden eagles, or 1,000 Gaijin coins, sorry. So Gaijin isn't going to cut themselves short by increasing the market and driving down the price. But this thing used to be incredibly overpowered. It used to be battle rating 3.7, I believe, but they have increased it up to 4.7 in the recent years. Mainly because of how powerful it is. It's basically the long-barreled 75mm gun found on the Panzer IV H, found on a Puma chassis. It's not as powerful as it used to be, but it still is a long barrel 75mm, and that thing is powerful on any chassis. We then have the Command Panzer. This is a Panzer IV, plain and simple. It's basically just like a commander's version of a tank. The one downside though is it doesn't have a electric turret traverse, it's only hand cranked. So the turret traverse speed is abysmal. So it's not as good as the regular Panzer IV H or J. Well, it's not as good as the H, the J is the same thing. So I wouldn't really recommend this. Again, like the KV2, sorry, it's battle rating 3.7. So it doesn't really have the best of lineups. So I can't really recommend it. A tank that they may bring back is the M4 Sherman, or the German Sherman. This used to be incredibly powerful in the early days of War Thunder, because most American players, don't know where to shoot other Shermans. So you could kind of angle this tank and shoot it pretty well, or they couldn't really get through it. M4 Shermans do struggle to penetrate other M4 Shermans. The armour isn't amazing, but considering this gun only penetrates 104mm of armour, you can see with an angled turret like this it's already 100mm thick. Not so much here, but you can kind of make the armour work on this tank. But because it is now battle rating 4.0 instead of 3.7 I believe that it used to be, it's not as good as it's nowhere near as good as it used to be. The American teams are also better, and the American team now has a lot more better tanks. There's also been lots of different things added recently. So like the Swedish tech tree has a lot of high penetration rounds at this low battle rating. So there are tanks now that can get through to you, sorry. I'll go back to the German. It's not as good as it used to be. If they do bring it back for sale though, it is a nice collector's tank. It is one of the rarest tanks in War Thunder. Not as rare as an E100 obviously, but not many people have this. We also have the German Churchill. Again, this is another tank that used to be pretty powerful but is now kind of bad. The only downside with this Churchill is it's got a very front turret plate which is only 90mm thick, which at battle rating 4.3 is easily penetrated. The tank itself does have a pretty high penetration APC-BC round, but again it does lack explosive filler. But with 132mm of penetration, you can't really complain. Obviously it is a Churchill, so it is very slow, the armour is quite redundant now, and the gun isn't the best. We also have the German KV-1B. This is basically the exact same as the KV-1B found in the Russian tech tree, except this tank obviously faces the Soviets. The KV-1s are famous for having pretty bad penetrating guns. As you can see, we only have around 88mm of penetration. And this tank has a lot more armour than that. Our stock armour here is 75mm thick, and we also have a plate covering it which is an additional inch thick. So it does make the front armour of this tank very, very powerful. So if you are facing a Soviet team, they are going to struggle to penetrate that. So it is a pretty nice premium tank. It is only available on the Gaijin store, so they probably aren't going to bring this back for sale. But if you can afford it, then it is a nice little premium grinder. It's not amazing, mainly due to that poor gun, but you can tank a lot of shells. We then move on to the Brummbär. This has a 150mm howitzer on it. It's a pretty mean vehicle, to be honest. I think it's a Panzer IV chassis, yeah. This thing is pretty insane. It's not got the best penetration in the world. It's got 61mm of penetration on its high explosive round and 185 on its high explosive anti-tank shell. I would use the high explosive round personally though. You can overpressure people pretty easily with this thing. That being said though, it is battle rating 4.3 and it's got a reload speed, sorry I'm going to the crew. It's got a reload speed of around 17 seconds with an ace crew. So it's not really that effective, especially at 4.3 where a lot of the tanks are going to have very high fire rates. Well, it's a nice little meme vehicle. It is fairly expensive if I remember correctly, so I can't really recommend picking this thing up, but it's a good bit of fun and it fits in my 4.3 lineup as well. We then have the VFW. This is basically a party bus with a long barrel 88 on it. Also got Mike Gosboom's face on it, which I forgot I had there. Pretty terrifying, I'm sure you'll agree. Anyway, this thing has a lot of penetration. 230mm to be exact. It basically has the same gun as the Panzer King, King Tiger, sorry, if I can find it. I'm looking here now. This thing, sorry. So it's a pretty decent little gun. Obviously, it was designed to be a flak gun, so it can elevate its gun quite a lot. We do also have an airburst round, a time shell. Not really that useful, to be honest though. I think this is on the marketplace now for quite a lot of money, so it's probably not going to be coming back anytime soon. I wouldn't really say it's worth it. At 5.7 it does give you a nice little premium to go with the Panthers and the Tigers. Probably the best 5.7 premium in the German tech tree. This thing's pretty shockingly bad. But yeah, it's not really worth it in my opinion. We then have the Panzer 470. This is pretty decent. It's got the same gun I believe is found on the Panthers. So it has a lot of penetration with a decent amount of explosive filler, but not a lot. I wouldn't really recommend it though. It doesn't play as well as the other ones in the game. If we take a look at the armor here, we can see that it is flat just beneath the gun. So it is very easy to penetrate here. It's only 18mm thick. So it's not that effective. You can use it for sniping, but it does only have 5 degrees of gun depression, which does limit your ability to use a ridgelines. We then have the Furry Tiger. This is a vehicle that I do not have. It's basically a 5.3 Tiger with a camouflage on it basically. That's the only difference. It does also have premium modifiers obviously, but it's the exact same as a regular Tiger 1 tank. This is a lot of money on the Guardian marketplace, so I very much doubt this will ever come back on sale. But if you can get it, it's a pretty effective little tank. We then have the KV-1C. This is basically a captured KV-1 with a 75mm gun from a Panzer IV on it. Again, at battle rating 4.7, this thing used to be very, very powerful, but they have uptiered it to 5.0 now, which has reduced its efficiency a little bit, to be honest. There isn't really a 5.0 lineup for the German tech tree, whereas there was a 4.7 one. So it's kind of nerfed it a little bit. You can still use it at 5.3 pretty effectively, though I believe I use 5.7 now. You can use it, but it's nowhere near as effective as it used to be. It's still a brilliant little tank though. It's also pretty good in simulator battles. And finally for rank 3, we have the VK45-01. This was another prototype vehicle, and again this is a very early crafting event reward. So this is probably never going to come back on sale. Basically a Porsche Tiger with a diesel electric drive system. So it can go forwards, I believe, the same speed it can go backwards, which is pretty cool, but I believe it also has a pretty slow turret traverse as well. Yeah, targeting speed 4.8 degrees per second, which is pretty tragic to be honest. It's not really worth it in my opinion. I believe it's only around 80 Gaijin coins, but it's definitely not worth that. Alright, rank 4. We'll start with the bigger brother of the VK45. It is the Panzerbehelfswagen for 6p. Again, this is a Porsche Tiger. It's basically the Commander's variant again, so just like the Panzer IV one, it basically has no electric turret drive and has a hand-cranked turret. This means it's quite shit when it comes to actually fighting other vehicles because you can't really traverse your turret. But it does have all the benefits of the Porsche Panzer. Take a quick look at the armor. I believe it's got 200mm or 8 inches of armor. Yeah, so you've got 2 4-inch plates here. So it is fairly well armored from the front, at least the hull is. And it's fairly mobile, I believe. But I don't really think it's worth the money at all. I'd say that the VFW is a lot better at 5.7, despite it being a rank. This one is rank 4, that's rank 3. But I'd still say that this one is better. We then have the main grinder of the German tech tree, the Tiger 2H SLA-16. The main difference between this tank and the other Tiger 2 in the game is that I believe this has a petrol engine with slightly more power. Doesn't really change the way it drives though, it's a minimal increase in power. We have that long barreled 88 with a very high pen round, 240mm of penetration, and around 110 grams of TNT filler. This is pretty effective, it's pretty decent to be honest. The 6.7 meta now though is pretty dead, it's now going up to 7.3 with this lineup, but as you can see, no, don't use it in this one. You can still use it in this lineup though very effectively. There's not really too much to say about it, it is just a bog standard Tiger 2 from the tech tree, but with a slightly better engine. We then have the Jagdpanther, which has recently got a new skin, well it's got a new 4K texture I believe. It's not in the game yet, this is obviously pre-patch. It's not really worth getting in my opinion. It is only battle rating 6.0 with that long barreled 88mm gun. So you have the same firepower as the Tiger 2H, sorry, but obviously in a casemate hull. But you can use it for being a sneaky little tank destroyer. Tank destroyer meta is pretty much dead at this high battle rating. You're much better with a turret. and it's not really worth the money in my opinion. We then move on to the RU-251. This is probably one of the tanks that I've got the most kills with in War Thunder. I used it for a very long time. It's basically a light tank, and it was for a long time the only light tank in the German tech tree, which led to a lot of people complaining that it was pay to win because it was the only way that you could get a mobile tank was to pay for it. It does have a very high penetration gun though for battle rating 7.0 with 320mm of penetration with a high explosive anti-tank shell. The reload is comparable to the other German tanks, so you're not really losing any firepower you're not really losing rate of fire for that firepower. And it's also incredibly fast. As you can imagine though, being a light tank, its armor performance is pretty dog shit, only 30mm thick on the upper frontal plate, and the turret's even less than that, around 20mm thick. But it's very powerful. Arguably, it's one of the best tanks in the German tech tree for grinding, especially if you're playing around this meta. It can still be used at 7.3. Doesn't have a gun stabilizer, but you can't really have everything. We then move on to the Elephant. This was the reward for the last battle pass, so this definitely will not be coming back anytime soon. You can get it on the Guardian store though, or the Guardian marketplace, sorry. Not really worth it though, just a bog standard Elephant or a bog standard Ferdinand. Some minor differences maybe, but definitely not worth it. The next two tanks, the Flak Panzer 341 and the Panther 2. These may come back in the 10th year anniversary. They're basically just, they're not premiums or reward vehicles actually. They used to be in the tech tree around here, but they were removed for being a historic technically. Same with the Tiger 2105 as well as the Mouse actually. But in order to get these you had to be playing the game before a couple of years ago when they removed them. There's nothing special about them really, but they are quite unique now. Not many players have them, I guess. But again, not premium. They do have a good chance of coming back though. We then move into the 5th rank of the German tech tree, and we have the German M47. This is pretty decent because of its high explosive anti-tank shell, the M431. We also have the M82 nuke round as well. We also have a rangefinder which makes it pretty good in simulator battles. And it's a medium tank at 7.3. It does play more like a light tank though. It doesn't really have any armor. Its mobility is not the best, but still pretty mobile. You can't really bounce any incoming rounds with it, but it does have a fairly decent gun. I wouldn't really recommend it though. If you are going to get a rank 5 premium, I would recommend getting the Term 3. This has a 3-plane stabilizer, which I don't really know how that works. I think in War Thunder though, it's more of a 2-plane stabilizer. You can see here that it does have DM12 high explosive anti-tank shell as well as DM13. It does also have a 20mm autocannon mounted coaxially as well, which does make it pretty effective against light tanks. But it's the best rank 5 premium, but it's not the best rank 5 premium in the game for my opinion. And finally, rank 6, we'll start with the TAM2 IP. This thing is basically just a TAM2 with a little bit more armor on it. It does get composite blocks, which does give it a little bit more protection. We do have that very nice DM33 around here, but as you can see, we do not get any thermal imaging. We only get night vision, which is a little bit of a letdown, to be honest. At 8.7, you do kind of need thermal imaging to be highly competitive, especially in simulator battles. So I don't really know why this was added in my opinion. It seems like a little bit of a waste anyway. Anyway, for nearly 9,000 Golden Eagles, I cannot recommend this at all. You're much better with one of the two of our next vehicles. The first of which is a Leopard A1A1 L44. Like the XM1, this is one of the oldest one of the oldest premiums in War Thunder. We do have that night vision capability, or thermal capability, but we do only have the DM13 round. It's a very early APFSDS round. It doesn't create a lot of spalling, but it does have pretty high penetration, with nearly 400mm of pen. The tank itself is just a Leopard 1 chassis with a 120mm bolted onto it. This was a prototype upgrade from the Leopard 1A5 I believe, but didn't really go anywhere. It's not really that mobile, to be honest. You might think that being on a Leopard 1 chassis it will be quite fast, but with the significantly more weight of the 120 and the upgrades over time, it's nowhere near as fast as it used to be, so we don't really have that going for it either. The armor isn't really, there's nothing there to speak of, to be honest. I think you only have like 60 or you have 70mm on the upper frontal plate and pretty much none on the turret. So it is one of the oldest premiums in the game. It's still pretty decent. But with the next tank, our Leopard 2 Panzer Battalion 123, I'd say that this is a better choice for most players. If you can afford the rank 6 premiums, which are both $60, I would definitely recommend getting the Leopard 2. While it might be a little bit harder for new players to get into, we do have a better round. We have the DM23 instead of the DM13 found on the L44. We also have the exact same gun, the 120 L44, but we have a much more armoured and faster hull really. The tank also has a unique camo with that camouflage netting on top of it. Our armour as well, if we take a look in the extra view, we do have quite a lot of composite, especially on the upper frontal plate and on the turret sides and front, which does make it more survivable altogether. And our engine is also pretty powerful, 1,500 horsepower, gives us a power to weight ratio of, I can't work that out in my head. It's a lot better than the L44 though. This tank, the Leopard 2, it's much faster than this, it's got better armour and it has a better gun. So I don't really know why you'd buy this thing over the Leopard 2. But if you do want to grind out the German Tetri, I'd either recommend the Leopard 2 PZ BTL or the Tiger 2 or the IU251. Notable picks though are the German Sherman, the T34, and I guess this thing's pretty good. That's pretty much it, lads. We'll move on to the Soviets. Alright, the Soviet Tetri, this is one of the bigger ones, so it might take us quite a while. T26, it's obviously a starter premium, not really worth it in my opinion. Same with the T26E, a little bit better armoured I believe than this thing, but still not really worth it. The T-35, it's one of the land battleship things that the Russians were building in the 1930s, I believe. Not really worth it in my opinion. Decentish gun for battle rating 1.3, but not worth 2,000 golden eagles, not at all. The BT-70D was from Twitch Drop, so that's probably, well, it's not real worth it anyway. SU-57 was a American Lend-Lease, I believe. It's got a 57mm gun on the back of it. Does got a pretty good M86 round, 122mm of penetration at 2.3 is certainly nothing to laugh at. The RBT-5 is basically an BT-5 with two 250 kilo bombs with a rocket motor strapped to it. It certainly makes an impact when you see it on the battlefield, but you actually cannot aim this thing. These do not depress with the gun. They used to, but Gaijin nerfed that ability years and years ago. So you can't actually aim those, you just kind of have to hope you get a kill with it. You can use it, but I wouldn't really recommend it. Again, it's on the Gaijin store. It's not really worth paying it. The T3 is a captured German Panzer III, obviously. It's got the short barrel 50mm gun. You've only got the very early APC round, so you don't have a ballistic cap. You've only got that cap on it. So it's not going to do very well against... it's not going to have very good long range penetration. But it is only a 2.3, so we aren't really going to be fighting at long range. It's a fairly decent little tank. I don't really use it that much. I think I bought it when it was on sale quite a while ago. But nice little tank for grinding, not a really need to buy. The BA-11 was a reward for one of the World War events, I believe. There's nothing special about it, to be honest, other than the fact that it's just incredibly rare. Again, I wouldn't get it. It's ridiculously expensive and not really worth it in my opinion. The BM-824, basically like the Calliope in the American Tetri, it's just a meme vehicle really. We have 82mm M8 rockets. For 4,000 golden eagles, it's definitely not worth it. The M3 Lee Medium, again another Lend-Lease vehicle which was used quite a lot by the Soviets, but not really many people know about it. You got the same pretty decent 75mm gun. M61 is certainly nothing to scoff at. Not as much pen as the M4 Shermans, only by about 5mm, but still, it's a decent tank, especially for 2.7, you can make it work. We then move on to rank 2, starting with the T126. This is basically a prototype of the T50, I believe, or something like that. It's got a lot of angled armour on it. It's actually quite trolly. 55mm of thickness, sloped at 53 degrees, giving you around 3 inches of effective thickness on it. It's a pretty decent tank. Like a lot of heavily armoured vehicles, it's let down by its rather mediocre gun performance. 70mm of penetration at battle rating 3.0. It's not amazing, but you can make it work, and it is very, very trolly. For a light tank, it is a decent pickup. I don't know how much it costs, but it's a lot of fun to use, but it's not obviously going to grind out the full Tetri, sorry. The SU-76M I believe was a reward for some event a while ago. It's not really worth it in my opinion, plus it's on the marketplace. The ZUT-37 is technically an anti-air vehicle, but it plays a lot more, it plays much more like a tank destroyer. We have the BT round, which gives us 71mm of penetration. Our battle rating 2.3. It's not bad to be honest. It's basically an auto cannon. I believe it has a clip size of around 5 rounds or something like that. It's not a lot though. It basically bang 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 bang. It's alright. It's not particularly effective though. For 1000 golden eagles, it's not a bad pickup. I don't have it because I don't really play 2.3. A tank that you definitely should not get is the SU-76D. This thing is pretty bad. The 76mm cannon is a little bit underwhelming. It's the same gun that's found on the early T-34s. And it just looks dumb in my opinion. I don't really like this tank. It's a one-shot kill pretty much anywhere you shoot it because the crew compartment's so full and the ammunition is everywhere. Not really effective in my opinion. It is on the marketplace for pretty cheap if you are desperate, but not something that I'd recommend getting. We then have another land battleship, the SMK. This is basically a KV-1 that's been extended and has an additional turret on it. See here that we do have 2 different turrets. We've got one that has a 76mm and the other with a 45mm. Both guns have fairly decent shells, however the 76mm is obviously the go-to one. Again, like a lot of meme vehicles, it's let down by its gun performance. The 45mm gun is pretty redundant. It's got 70mm of penetration, but it's obviously not going to be the main hard hitter. That's going to be the 76mm. It does have a lot of crew inside it, which is arguably a positive or a minus. One shot here is going to kill the majority of your crew, and then we've got a shitload of ammunition here. So while it is fun meme vehicle, it is actually quite a lot of fun. It's pretty decent for grinding. It's obviously not the best tank in the world because you are quite slow. The gun is fairly decent, but as all, it is a heavy tank, so in an up tier you are going to get basically thrown around like a dog toy, and if you're in a down tier you're going to be the one that's ripping people apart. A tank that is very good is the BT-7A. This was a reward for Operation Heat. I think it's on the marketplace now. It's basically a BT-7 that has the 76mm gun from a T-34. So you have a very, very fast light tank with a fairly decent gun in it. I think I've got a kill at top tier with this thing once. It's just a good fun. It's not an amazing premium because it was one they gave out, so they never give it like the good reward modifiers. But if you can get your hand on one of these for cheap, it is well worth it. We then have the Kachucha rocket system. This is something that I've never personally been able to get. I think I was there when they were giving it out, where you had to get like 5 kills in a single life to get it, and so I can't be arsed with that. Again, it's another meme vehicle. You basically have the same 84, well you got 132mm rocket, sorry. So it is a little bit better compared to the B8 thing, but still not really that useful. They may give this away for the 10-year anniversary. It is something that they probably would do. It is a very, very old vehicle and pretty good if you can get it. Then have the Matilda. This is again another rare. It's basically a Matilda hull where they've put a T-34's gun into the turret somehow. This thing is one of the rarest vehicles in game, but it isn't really that effective, so I wouldn't really recommend trying to get it even if you could. We then have the Valentine. This is usually only given away on Valentine's Day. They probably aren't going to bring this back. It does have a pretty hard hitting gun though, 57mm with 122mm of penetration. Same gun I believe that's found on the Ram. It's pretty decent. It's a little nice grinder at battle rating 3.0. Don't really have an effective lineup with it, but you can take it out at 3.7 and 3.3. Because you've got that very high pen gun, it can still compete at that high battle rating. We then have the SU-85A. This is basically just an SU-85 that's been swapped the other way around, I guess. It's alright. It's not amazing though. Again, at 4.0 it does have a pretty decent lineup around it. I've got that fantastic BR365A shell with a lot of it's got a lot of TNT filler, sorry, it's got 164 grams, so it is very effective if you can actually penetrate something. And you've got the K if you want more penetration overall. Well, actually the A is better overall. Then have the T-34 1st Guards Tank Battalion, I believe. Yeah, battalion. 1st Tanks. Guards 1st Tank Brigade, sorry. Anyway, this tank is just a normal T-34. Basically just with a fancy new camouflage scheme. It's basically just a winter camouflage with some hashing, I guess. Pretty decent if you can get it. It's very, very old premium again. I can't remember when I actually got this. I think it was a long, long time ago. Not the best tank in the world. I'd say that this thing is better, the T-34E. It's a normal T-34 that's been up armoured with additional armour plate. This armour plate improves the survivability of the already fairly decent T-34. It's mainly on the turret and the side of the hull. The front of the hull isn't really affected at all, but it is still a pretty trolly tank. I don't have this. It was given away very early on in the War Thunder tank thing. So very few people have this, and it's fairly rare to see it on the battlefield. They could give this away again, but again it is on the Gaijin marketplace. Moving on to rank 3 and the big boys, the T-34-57 itself. This thing used to be 4.3 and was the meta. They now have up-tiered it to 4.7, where it still does perform fairly well. It does have a pretty decent lineup. I think I have set my... yeah, there's 4.7. Does along well with the LA7, the other T-34-57s, and of course the KV-85. Or is it this thing? Pretty, well, not overpowered, but pretty good gun at that battle rating. So while this is quite an old premium again, it still is one of the best in the game. Because they up-tiered it to battle rating 4.7, it can face the German 5.7 pretty frequently. But you are very fast, you got a hard hitting 57mm gun. Don't be fooled by the gun only being 57mm, it does have 145mm of penetration with 30 grams of TNT filler. So it is kind of similar to the 75mm gun found on the Panther tank. Obviously not as powerful, but it has a good punchy power to it. It can be used pretty effectively. We then move on to the KV-2. Like the KV-2 in the German tech tree, it has seen a little bit of a resurgence. This is one of the more rare vehicles in the game, but it does have a very long reload speed. Not really worth it in my opinion. We then have the SU-100Y. This is known as the box tank if any World of Tanks players out there. Basically it has a 130mm naval gun in it. It does have a semi-armor piercing capped ballistic cap shell, giving you 200mm of penetration with 2.3 kilos of filler. So very good if you actually can penetrate something, which you probably will be able to with those ballistic characteristics. But the tank is incredibly big, as you can see, and you aren't exactly subtle. There's not really any reason to buy this in my opinion. Maybe if you really want it, but I don't really know why. Then I have the KV-1E. This is the contemporary of the KV-1B in the German tech tree. Pretty much exactly the same. Additional add-on armor. It's got a high amount of survivability but a terrible gun. Pretty much exactly the same as the one in the German tech tree. Moving on to the M4A2, this is one of the tanks that I would recommend people stay clear of. You do have the 76mm gun on the Sherman, so you do have slightly better penetration. But at 5.3, you really do get up-tiered quite a lot to 6.3, and you kind of just get bashed around a bit. The KV-22 on the other hand is a tank that I always wanted but I've never actually bought. Basically a KV tank but with a lot better turret armor. I believe it has 100mm all the way around it, which makes it incredibly well protected. It's not as powerful as it used to be, mainly because the tanks around it have got a lot more powerful, but it still has a very powerful gun, at least for the battle rating of 5.7. 135mm, it doesn't sound a lot, but considering the Tiger only has 80mm of armor, you can still do a hell of a lot of damage with this tank. As I said though, the only downside is it is very expensive on the Gaijin marketplace at the minute. I believe it's 120 Gaijin coins or something like that. But if you can get this on sale or they bring it back somehow, it is well worth it. The KV-2 with the ZIS-6 gun is pretty much a meme, not really worth it at all. It has a pretty decent gun to be honest, but it is a KV-2. It's very big, unsubtle. It doesn't really well protected. It's flat armor here with only 75mm. So you can get penetrated pretty much by everyone. Then have the T5, which is basically a captured Soviet Panther tank, or it's a captured German tank put into Soviet service, sorry. Has a pretty nice camouflage here. You do also have the standard camouflage, which is kind of a bit of a mix of colours. I prefer the winter camouflage. Looks a bit nicer and it makes the tank look a bit more dead as well. It's just a Panther tank, to be honest. You do not have the APCR round, you only have the APC-BC, but that is the best shell to use anyway. It's a very, very good tank. It used to be very expensive, but it now has dropped down a lot on the Guardian marketplace for some reason. I actually bought this when it was expensive, so I lost quite a bit of value there, but oh well. It's a very, very good for 5.7. I have it in my lineup here with a gold. I have an ace crew in it because I like it that much. Basically, you control the German players by having a Panther as well. Most German players don't know how to face Panthers because that's all they play. So it can be nice to... You can combat the German rush with that. It's pretty nice. Moving into the 4th rank, we'll start with the T-34-85E. Again, this is a T-34 that has just been up-armoured slightly. As you can see, we basically just have makeshift cage armour on it. It does absolutely nothing in game, it's just more aesthetic. Quite a nice collectibles item. They have put this back on for sale quite a few times. It's just a bog standard T-34-85. If you do like these tanks, then having a premium one is a nice addition. Then I have the KV-122. Again, if you've ever played World of Tanks, you know that this was the KV-1S in that game, where it was incredibly overpowered. However, in War Thunder, it isn't really that good. You basically have a heavy tank with battle rating 4.7 armor, with a reload speed of like 20 seconds. While you do have the 122mm gun, it's not particularly that effective in my... Well, it is an effective gun, but that reload speed just nukes it really. At 5.3, most tanks are still going to have a sub 10 second reload speed. So you having like 22 seconds it just ruins your ability to be competitive in my opinion. Especially if you're a player and your aim isn't that good. It's not really good one to buy. Moving on to the SU-122P. This is basically a 122 gun. You do have the BR-471D shell, which is very powerful. It's a pretty decent tank at 5.7. I'd say it isn't as good as the SU-12254, but it is a lot lower battle rating. And it basically just tries to be this tank. I wouldn't say it's worth the money, to be honest. As I said, in the German tech tree, tank destroyers are basically dead in this meta. It's just not really worth it. Moving on to the IS-2 Revenge. This tank's actually pretty powerful. They recently gave it its 14.5mm gun, or 12.7, sorry. It is a 1944 mod of the IS-2, meaning it does have the up-armoured frontal plate, which is pretty nice. It's a variable thickness, but from the front it's around 170mm thick. It does still have a very long reload of the IS-2, but with that armour, decent mobility, you can make it work. Then have the T-44-122. Pretty decent tank actually, it's a lot faster than people expect. The major weak spot here is the driver's port. It's just sticks out like a sore thumb and it's very, very weak, only 75mm thick. Like the other 122mm guns in the game, it does have a very, very long reload speed. You do only have the 471B shell. While it does have pretty good penetration against flat armor, its angled armor penetration isn't amazing. It's pretty decent, but I wouldn't really recommend this tank compared to some of our other tanks, which we'll get onto shortly. Then have the Object 248, which was the reward for the latest Battle Pass. Pretty decent 100mm gun, but as it's currently in the Battle Pass, it's not going to be coming out anytime soon. It might come on the Guardian store in a couple of months' time or a few weeks' time. Pretty decent tank, to be honest. Can't really fault it. Although the tank that I would recommend people getting, well, one of the tanks I'd recommend people getting for rank 4 is the T-34-100. This tank isn't as powerful as it used to be. It does have a very nice Polish camouflage, if that's something you're interested in. You do get the very, very powerful BR-412D shell, giving you 240mm of penetration. Its name is because it has a 100mm gun. The gun depression is pretty bad with only 3 degrees, but obviously your armor isn't amazing, it's only a T-34 hull, but you have a very powerful gun, and at 6.3 you can make this work, especially if you have a few of the other premiums like the IS-2, and it's got the 2S3M, this is a really good lineup. But finally, we do also have the IS-6, this is probably the best rank 4 premium for the Soviets. It is a lot higher battle rating at 7.0, but we do have stuff like the IS-3 and then some other stuff around it, the ZSU. So it does have a lineup. There's not really too much to say about the IS-6. It's got very, very good armor. The gun is pretty mediocre though. It's got the same 122mm gun at battle rating 7.0 that we had down here at 6.0. So terms of firepower, like all of the heavy tanks, it's not really that good. It relies more on its armour. The IS-6 though, it is surprisingly mobile though compared to a lot of other heavy tanks. And to finish ranks 4, we also have the PT-7657. This is a tank that I don't have because I couldn't be bothered to get it. It is considered very overpowered. It's got the BR-281. It's basically a ZSU 57-2 but -1 gun. It's just one of the guns from it. It's fairly decent. It's just got a high rate of fire. People think it's overpowered because it can easily penetrate the sides of vehicles. It's battle rating 8.0 now, which in my opinion is a little bit high, to be honest. But people find these really, really annoying. I really should have unlocked this probably, because it probably is going to be worth a lot of money in the Guardian store. But at 8.0, Guardian don't really have a lineup. It's more 8.3. I guess you could take it into that lineup if you really wanted. It would still be fairly effective. But it's a lot of money. I can't really recommend people getting it. Although it is very, very good. If you don't have it though, there's a lot better options to choose. Then move on to rank 5, which is pretty scarce. We have the Object 120, which in my opinion is pretty bad well, I just don't like this tank. It's got a very, very powerful gun, but it's very, very fragile. It's the definition of a glass cannon. It does have a lineup at 7.3, but it's unstabilized. If you're on a wide open map, then you can use it pretty effectively. But if you're on a tight urban map, which most maps in War Thunder are now, it's not really that effective. We then have the T10A, which is a heavy tank with a single point gun stabilizer, which basically means it only works when you go in fairly slow. It's actually pretty effective, but because it's located at battle rating 7.7, it is going to get up tiered quite a lot to 8.3, where it is kind of going to get bashed around a bit. So because of this, rank 5 doesn't really have any premium vehicle that's really worth it in my opinion. I think if you're going to buy a rank 5, you may as well just buy a rank 6. So starting with that, we have the T55AM1. This is the older premium available for the Soviets. It's fairly decent, to be honest. We do have that very, very good BR-412D shell, which is surprisingly good at battle rating 8.3. Most people will get this tank and use the Sabo round on it, but it's not actually that good. You're far better using the BR-412D shell and switching to the Sabo if you do encounter a heavily armoured opponent. This round will still penetrate pretty much 99% of all the enemies you face. The AM1 does have increased protection with this composite armour at the front. It protects the upper frontal hull and the turret sides, but not the gun mantlet. The tank doesn't have any thermal imaging, but at 8.3 can't really complain about that. Gun is also fully stabilised, and the tank is fairly mobile, to be honest. The T72AV term steps things up a bit though. It has a 3BM42 Mango round, which is still fairly decent. Do have very high resolution thermal imaging as well as a laser rangefinder. This is a lot higher battle rating though, at battle rating 9.7. So it is arguable what tank people should get if they want to grind out the Soviet tech tree. In terms of a bang for buck, then obviously the T72AV is a lot better. But the T55AM still does have a very, very good lineup at 8.3. Arguably the Soviet 8.3 lineup is more effective than the 9.7. You've got such good vehicles like the BMP-2, the Sturm, T10M. We also have the newer T55AMD here with its active protection system. So it's really up to you which one of these tanks you think is best. I have a lot more fun playing the T55AM, but if you're going to play $60 for one of these tanks, you probably are better getting the T72AV. It does still work in a lineup. It's a pretty decent vehicle, to be honest. It's got a bad reputation more because the people that buy them aren't the smartest and they're just rushing for top tier. But anyway, if you are going to buy a rank 6, I probably would recommend getting the terms. If you want any other premium in the Soviet tech tree, then the IS-6, T5, the Valentine, the SMK, T126. These are tanks that stand out to me. Finally, let's move on to the British. Alright, welcome to the British tech tree. Kinda suffering. A13 Mark 1, not really worth buying. Kinda like all the other battle rating 1.0 rank 1 premiums, not really worth it in my opinion. The Electro 1 was a award for Battle of Arrakis, the last year's event. Got a pretty decent high explosive anti-tank shell, but not really worth it in my opinion. Pretty nice mean vehicle, but at battle rating 1.7, it doesn't really have a lineup, and it's pretty bad overall, to be honest. Same for the Independent. For 2,100 Golden Eagles, it is not worth that at all. Got a pretty decent 47mm gun, pretty high penetration if I remember correctly. 49mm for 1.3, it's not bad, to be honest. The A13 Mark II, I believe this was one of the pre-order vehicles for the British tank tree when it was first introduced. It's not really worth it, to be honest. I think it has a 40mm pom-pom gun. Not really worth it at all in my opinion. It's just not worth it, is it? Crusader, this is a pretty decent tank actually. Especially with a battle rating 2.7. Quite iconic from the Desert Rats campaign, the Tunisia campaign. It's a pretty nice tank. I'm not too sure how you get this. Although it is pretty decent. Britain does have a pretty substantial 2.7 lineup. Along with the other Crusader in the tech tree, the gun carrier, AC, a few other vehicles. We then have the AC-1. This was a reward from Operation Winter last year, I believe. Not really that useful. It's got the same 40mm gun found on quite a few of the other British tanks around this battle rating. You do have the solid shot, which has higher pen, and then the APC, or the APHE, sorry, for a bit more post-pen damage. Not really that useful in my opinion though. The Cromwell 5 RP3, same as the Cromwell 5 in the tech tree. You're armed with the 75mm gun, I believe. In real life, it had a lot better high explosive damage, but it has less penetration with its APC round. Not to worry though, it does have RP3 rocket strap to the top of it. Again, like the RBT5 in the Soviet tech tree, you cannot aim these rockets, you just kind of have to hope they hit. The rockets are actually quite powerful. If you ever watch any of the Orange Dooms videos, you'll know just how deadly these things are. And especially in the age of overpressure, these are even more deadly. But because you can't aim them, not really that useful. Then have the Matilda Hedgehog, which was an event vehicle not too long ago. These are just a meme, they can't really be used for anything. Again, same 40mm gun. You do have a little bit better penetration though with this one. Oh, it's the exact same actually. You got a lot of tanks around this battle rating where it's just all the same guns really, but battle rating 2.7, pretty decent lineup. Not the fastest tanks in the world, especially the Matilda, it's slow as anything, but it's a nice little vehicle. We then have the Grant 1, this is a British M3 Lee, same as in the American tech tree. Again, this was a very early premium in 2016. Well, very early for this video. It's not really worth buying in my opinion. I believe it is actually quite expensive as well. You do only have an APC BC round, but it has got pretty high penetration, especially for battle rating 2.7 with nearly 90mm of pen. Do I have the M6? Wait, oh, I'm looking at the wrong one. I do also have the M61, that mute shell. It's pretty decent. If it wasn't so expensive, I probably would get it. A tank that is certainly out of my price range though is the AEC Mark II. This has a 57mm gun strapped on it instead of two 20mm. Again, you do only have APC BC, but it does have very high penetration with 132mm. This is one of the most expensive premiums in War Thunder for some reason. It's not as expensive as the E100 or something like that, but this is very, very expensive despite it being a rank 2 battle rating 3.0 vehicle in a fairly niche tech tree. Moving on to rank 3, we then also have the Achilles. This is an American vehicle that was given to Britain for the Desert campaign. And because it is British, we do only have the solid shot round. However, at battle rating 3.3, we do have 190mm of penetration. The only downside with this tank is I believe it doesn't have an electric turret traverse. You can see her targeting speed 3.1 degrees per second, which is abysmal. But apart from that, the gun is very good. It's the 76 QF17. I believe it is the famous British 17 pounder. So it does have a very powerful gun on the thing. But because of that turret traverse, it's questionable. I do use it quite a bit. It's quite a good backup. It does look quite cool. Very powerful gun, but because of that turret traverse, it's not really adaptable. If you're on a long open map and you can kind of camp and snipe people, then it's very, very good. But if you're on a tight city map, it's pretty trash. The Excelsior, again, it's a very old premium. You never see this in game really anymore. It's basically a Cromwell that got thick. Nice big tracks. It's like a Cromwell and a Churchill had a baby really. The armor's pretty decent, 4.5 inches on the top, and the same for the upper frontal plate. The gun is the same as on the Churchill though, M61. Not amazing. Again, I don't think you can actually buy this anymore. It's actually sold out on the marketplace, I believe. The Sherman Firefly, or the Polish Sherman, is actually pretty decent as well. Do have 190mm of penetration, so we have the exact same gun as on the Achilles, but at much higher battle rating. The tank does have a decent turret traverse though. I'm not sure how much. 17 degrees per second. It shows you just how much better it is compared to the Achilles. You are quite a high profile though, so you aren't as good at sniping as the Achilles, but it's a pretty decent tank at 4.7. Britain does have a decent 4.7 lineup with the Churchill 7, the other Firefly, Avenger, and now the Yeast of Arc. Moving on to the Comet Iron Duke, this is one of the first premiums that I actually got for the tanks. This tank again is now very, very expensive in the marketplace, mainly due to its high penetration round, the Shot SV Mark 1. 220mm of penetration at a battle rating 5.7 is certainly nothing to laugh at. This thing basically low pens the German tanks or the Panthers and the Tigers. You can basically just bully them with this thing. And that is why it was so powerful. It used to be battle rating 5.3 back in the day, then they increased it to 5.7. We then have the AC4. This is an Australian tank. Again, we have that great 17 pounder gun with the Shot Mark 8 with 190mm of penetration. It's a pretty decent tank. I've had a lot of good games with this thing. It does look a bit wonky, but it is a Australian vehicle, so that's their fault, not the British. Pretty truly upper frontal plate. It's not as thick as you'd think though. It's only 2 inches thick, but because of that sloping, we do have around 4.5 inches of effective thickness. So certainly nothing to laugh at. In a pinch, someone might bounce off you, but it's not the most effective tank, although it is one of the best rank 3 premiums in for the British. We then have the QF 3.7 RAM. This has a 94mm, I think this was an anti-aircraft gun if I remember correctly, that they strapped onto a tank. Yes, I believe it is. I think this had a powered RAM or something like that. It has a very powerful solid shot round with 204mm of penetration. It's a pretty decent tank. It's same as the British. It's a British equivalent of the VFW in the German tech tree. Basically just a low profile, high power gun. I'm not sure how much this is on the marketplace, but it was fairly cheap and it's also pretty decent, especially if you have something like this, or even if you just have the regular tech tree one. It's a nice little backup. It's obviously not a first spawn being a tank destroyer, but it can get the job done. Another fairly rare vehicle is a Black Prince. This thing has been dead for a long time. Because it's battle rating 6.0, it just kind of gets bullied by everything at that battle rating. It should go down to 5.7 really in my opinion. It does have the same firepower as the Comet though. It does have the very good APDS round. The gun isn't stabilised, but it does have much better armour protection compared to the regular Churchills. It's got 6 inches of armour on the upper frontal plate and on the turret. The difference between this was basically the post-war British tank design, or one of the post-war British tank design, but it obviously lost out to the Centurion, which we're going to take a look at next. Now this tank, you cannot actually get this in the British tech tree anymore. It's the Centurion from the Swedish tech tree basically. It has 3 of the Robot 52 ATGMs. These are SAKO guided. They're pretty decent, 600mm of penetration. I don't really see them adding this thing back to the British tech tree. I don't think you can get this anymore. In fact, it is right here in the Swedish tech tree. I liked it so much I actually bought it twice. Shame on me for giving Gaijin money. But it is a good premium. The gun is fully stabilised and we do have the incredibly good rounds. The solid shot round, the stock round, is actually very good and probably should use that for the majority of kills. If you come across a more heavily armoured opponent, then the APDS round is fantastic as well. Then also have the Centurion Action 10 or the Action X, I'm not sure which is the correct name. It's basically the exact same as the Stridsvagn 81. This was in fact the replacement for this tank when they removed this. It's basically the exact same tank with a slightly more protected turret, I believe. I think the turret is slightly thicker around here. It definitely does have a different turret design, but they basically play the same. You obviously don't get the free missiles, but it's not exactly a terrible loss. We then move on to the AVRI, the Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineer, sorry. It's basically a 165mm gun with firing just Hesh. It's very, very powerful. Basically, if you land a hit on an enemy, it is pretty much guaranteed to kill them. Especially if you hit around the crew compartment, then you're pretty much going to get a one-shot kill. It's not the easiest tank in the world to use. It's got a very, very low velocity gun, only 259 meters per second. So obviously do take that into account. If you're a newer player, this isn't going to be an easy tank to use. Especially if you mainly play in realistic battles where you aren't going to get that aiming reticle. Then move on to the Centurion Mark 5-1. This was in the Battle Pass last year, I believe, for Steel Centurion. This is basically a Centurion Mark 10 hull with a Centurion Mark 3 turret, I believe. You still only have the 84mm gun. We're not, excuse me, we don't have that 105mm yet. But we do still have the same fantastic ammunition. If we take a look at the hull armor, we do see that we do have a slightly better hull, I believe. We have add-on armor. Yeah, we have an additional add-on armor plate here. So the turret, the whole front is incredibly good compared to the other Centurions. You don't have as good side armor of this tank, but I'd say that this is probably the best premium Centurion that you can get. Like I said, it is on the Gaijin marketplace, I believe. You can't buy it for Golden Eagles, obviously. If you can get this and you want to grind out the British Tech Tree, you can obviously grind all the way up to battle rating 10.0 with it, which is fantastic. So I'd say that this is definitely the one you want to get if you want a premium Centurion. Moving on to rank 6, we have the dreaded Shot Caldolette, a tank that I used to despise, but it's now actually not too bad. Battle rating 8.3, so you are going to be going up against the Soviet 8.3 quite a lot, which is, comparing this thing to the T55 AM1 makes this thing look like a joke. You basically have nothing going for you really. You've got a lot of smoke grenades, which is pretty good. You've got the 105mm gun. You have the M111 round, which isn't too bad. It's basically a DM23 clone. So it's fairly decent. No thermal optics as you'd expect. This is no longer available, again, in the British Tech Tree. It's now in the Israeli Tech Tree, Moving on to the Ruicat, or Roicat. This is a 105mm gun 8x8 chassis. You do have thermal imaging and you do have DM33, giving it pretty decent post-pen damage, to be honest. 408mm of penetration is certainly nothing to laugh at all. The Generation 1 thermal imaging isn't the best, but it's still better than having no thermals. The tank is surprisingly fast, but isn't particularly manoeuvrable. You do struggle to get in and out of tight places a bit, which can slow you down quite a lot. But it is fairly agile. It's a nice little tank. But because of the introduction of our newest tank, the Challenger DS, I'm not too sure whether it's worth picking up the Ruicat. This tank is one that I haven't actually bought, mainly because I've grinded out pretty much all of the British Tech Tree and I can't really justify spending another 60 quid on it. But it's basically just a Challenger 1 Mark 3, I believe, or Challenger 1 Mark 2, sorry. So it's basically a copy and paste with a new camouflage. We do have the L23A1, which is fairly decent. It's kind of like a DM33 clone, not quite as good. Still only have first gen thermal imaging. The tank is incredibly slow though, like all of the other British Challengers. The armour is arguably pretty decent as long as you don't get hit in the lower frontal plate. You are going to stop pretty much anything that hits you that is a chemical warhead, but APDS rounds and APFSDS and other kinetic energy penetrators are just going to low pen you. The driver has 3 explosive ammunition rounds stored underneath his arse, which is always a pretty terrifying thing to be sat on, I guess, but that's how the British designed it. It's fairly powerful, but it's nowhere near as good as, say, the Panzer Battalion thing in the German Tech Tree. I don't really know why they added this. It would have been a lot better to have like a premium Challenger 2, like a early model or something like that. Even the Chieftain Mark 10 with the Chieftain Mark 11, which isn't in the game, which had thermal imaging, probably would have been a better premium. But anyway, it's a struggle to know what to recommend for the British Tech Tree. Usually in the rank 6 you would go with this later one because it's a little bit better. But this Challenger is very slow. It's got an average gun, to be honest. The armor's alright, but not amazing. The Ruicat, it doesn't really have a lineup at 8.7, and the Shot Caldolette you probably can't even buy. If you're trying to grind out the British Tech Tree, I'd recommend the Centurion Mark 5-1. Not the Black Prince, that's pretty trash. QFRAM's alright, AC4's alright, Comet if you can afford it, but I think it's ridiculously expensive. Cromwell RP3 is pretty good fun, and pretty much everything else I wouldn't recommend. All that being said, let's move on to the Japanese. Alright, the Japanese tech tree, not one that I am particularly experienced with. I don't really play the Japanese that much, especially the low tier. Starting with the Hago Commander, not really worth it in my opinion. We have the Kachi, which is that amphibious tank I believe. Not really worth it in my opinion. I don't think you can even get it anymore. You can make it look ridiculously stupid. It's currently being added to Enlisted in the Pacific campaign. If you're interested in that, it's probably a lot better in that game than it is in this one. Then also have the Rogo, again not something that I've bought. I guess if you want it, it's there. We then have the Chiha shotgun. This is quite a good meme vehicle I believe. I haven't played it. It has 31mm of penetration. The muzzle velocity is pretty terrible, only 290 meters per second. But if you want some fun at 1.7, you can use it to grind out rank 3, so you can get all the way up to 5.7 with it. Although there isn't really much of a lineup at 1.7 I guess. But it is a good little bit of fun. It's one of the meme vehicles in game that not many people know about. Then I have the Chi-He, which is one of the staple Japanese tanks if I believe correctly. It's got a fairly decent main gun round with 77mm of penetration. At battle rating 2.7 it's also fairly effective, along with the Chi-He as well in the tech tree, as long as the Chiha long gun, very good tank. I don't have this because I don't really play low tier Japan, but I've heard a lot of good people say good things about this tank, so it may well be worth the money. Then I have the Chi-Nu 2. This is the same as the Chi-Nu in the tech tree at 3.3, except this thing has a lot more powerful gun. It has a 75mm Type 2 Model 2. We have two different types of APHE. I'm not too sure which one's the best. They look fairly similar to me. I always typically use the Type 4. But this tank punches well above its weight in terms of actual penetration. 151mm of pen with 80 grams of TNT filler. You can penetrate pretty much anything in this tank around its battle rating, and I frequently use it in an up tier up to 5.7. Speaking of which, we have our heavy tank number 6. This was a Tiger tank which was shipped to Japan, but I think it actually got sank on the way there in a submarine. I'm not too sure you can buy this anymore. I think you can get it on the marketplace. It's pretty decent. It's obviously just a Tiger tank within the Japanese tech tree. It's got a fairly small lineup though, as well as the M4A3, a post-war Japanese Sherman, as well as I think I up tier it to 6.0 actually. I think I up tier it to 6.0 with the M4A1. It's a pretty decent tank. I've had a lot of good games in it. It's a little bit hit and miss though because the Japanese tech tree is so thin really. There's not really many tanks to take up in a lineup with. I think it is also incredibly expensive on the marketplace now. Going down to rank 4, we have the Ho-Ri prototype. It is the earlier model of the Ho-Ri production, which is found later on at 7.3. This thing is 6.7. It's got fairly decent gun depression with 10 degrees. The APHE is also pretty good with 8 inches of penetration. It's fairly good. It's got 200 grams of TNT explosive filler, making it very effective. I never really found it that good though. At 6.7 you don't really have a good lineup. Type 61s and the STA3s. I believe this thing is an autoloader, which is pretty decent. Yeah, 6-second autoloader. I've never really found this thing to be that good. It's kind of outdated at 6.7 alongside all these things. So I wouldn't really recommend buying it. I've never actually really played this. You can see here that I've got 27 free repairs left out of which comes with 30 compared to this thing, which I don't have any left because I played it that much. So wouldn't really recommend this thing at all. Then also have the Type 75 MLRS. This is basically like a HIMARS thing, but even, well, not as good. It has the, I don't even know what these are, 130mm. They're actually not too bad, the rockets themselves. 51mm of penetration. At battle rating 7.0, you are likely to kill anything you actually hit with it. But it's a fairly niche vehicle, obviously. It's not exactly easy to use. And while it can be effective if you're a new player and you're not really that used to aiming, or you want a vehicle that is a repetitive and pretty effective grinder, then this really isn't the vehicle. This is more of a very expensive meme vehicle that not many people actually use. You don't really see it on the battlefield that much. The only time I've really seen it is a Flight Daily video, I think. So I'd give this one a miss as well. We then also have the Type 74G. This is the top tier Japanese vehicle, which is probably long overdue an update. I think this tank is probably going to get replaced by a 9.7 at some point. It's fairly decent. It's got Type 93, which is DM33, sorry. It's not amazing though. The tank is pretty slow and doesn't really have that good of armor. Only 80mm on the lower frontal plate and 40mm on top. The turret is a little bit trolly, but it's not really worth... It's not a good tank in my opinion. Plus Japan's top tier isn't amazing at the minute, to be honest, so I wouldn't really recommend buying it. At battery rating 9.0 you also don't really have a lineup, apart from the Type 16, the 93. The Type 16 is pretty effective, the 93 isn't, and all these tanks are just copy and paste of each other. So it's not really a fun grind in my opinion, and I wouldn't really recommend it. If you are trying to grind out the Japanese tech tree, then I would recommend the Chinu 2. If you can get it, the heavy tank number 6. These three really aren't really effective. This is one of the biggest downside of the Japanese tech tree. It's just not really that fun to grind out. Anyway, that being said, let's move on to China. Alright boys, China's pretty sparse, so we should fly through these as well as all the other nations. This video is probably bloody long now, so I do apologise, but can't really make it any quicker. T26, not really worth it. M4A4 is pretty decent to be honest. At 3.7 you do also have a pretty good lineup. M24, M4A4, the Achilles or whatever it's called in the American tech tree. It's pretty decent. I'd recommend this if you can afford it. The M3A3 again at 2.7, pretty decent tank, but not really worth it. You are far better getting this thing. The M64, this was a reward for the Battle Pass I believe a few years ago. Basically just a Chinese M18 Hellcat. I think this is for sale on the marketplace. It's pretty effective. I mean, it's the only tank you're going to get if it's a rank 3. That's all they have available. Not really worth the money though, especially when you can just get the T3485. This is a number 215. Not really sure about why it's called that, other than probably the factory number or the model of what it was made. Basically just a regular T3485 as you'd expect, just copied and pasted into the Chinese tech tree to buff out the premiums. It's a pretty decent premium grinder, but there's not really too much to say. It is literally just a T3485. You take it alongside the Guy, which is basically just a T34 but with a bigger machine gun on it, which does make it pretty cool. Then also have the IS2 number 402. Again, it's just a regular IS2 but with the letters 402 spray printed on the side for some reason. It's pretty decent. This isn't the 1944 mod, so you don't have the better armor scheme, so you will get penetrated here quite a lot. It's alright for grinding. I don't know why it's 6.0, it did used to be 5.7. I'd stick with the T3485 with the already pretty good 5.7 lineup. Then have the ZTZ59A. This thing used to be battle rating 8.0, but then they decreased it down to 7.7. I thought it was already pretty good at 8.0. We do have a laser rangefinder as well as a BR412D shell. Granted, we don't have any type of advanced armor scheme. It is basically just a T55 hull. Pretty decent armor though, especially against conventional rounds. Nearly 200mm of effective thickness. It's a pretty good tank really. I don't really know why they dropped its battle rating down. I use it in this lineup here. I don't really know why. It's a good tank if you can get it. It's fairly good. It's basically a T55 AM from the Soviet tech tree but without the advanced armor schemes. Moving on to rank 6, we have the WMA 302. This tank is pretty funky looking, but is actually pretty effective in game. It's very high up and has pretty bad gun depression, which can make it quite hard to shoot down at people if they're below you. But the tank itself does have some pretty decent ammunition. We have the Type 83 APDS, which is basically a DM23 clone. We also have the GP105, which is a tandem warhead missile, pretty decent. Do also strangely have a proximity fused warhead, high explosive round. Guess you can use it against helicopters, but not really that important. We then also have high resolution thermal imaging, which is very nice, especially for simulator battles and the wide open maps in ground realistic. Do also have a scout as well. This tank is probably the best tank to get in rank 6 at the minute. The tank does fit into the 8.3 lineup very well. Just like the Soviets, the Chinese have a very, very strong 8.3 lineup. So here we have the T69, the T62, the Object 122, the WM8301, which this fits nicely in. Then also have the CM25, which gets TOW-2Bs, which are the top-down attack missiles. Also have the air defense system, as well as a few other vehicles which are very, very powerful. So the WMA is probably more effective than the ZTZ-96, which we'll cover shortly. Anyway, the T62-545, I don't think you can actually buy this anymore. I think they removed it from the sale because it was so shit. It's basically just a T62 from the Soviet tech tree, but again with more numbers spray painted on the side. I mean, it's not the best premium in the world. It is just a T62 as you'd expect. It's got pretty decent 3BM 4 shell. I think the 4 round is actually better than the 3. Is that correct? I think one has more pen, one has more post pen. Got a very high muzzle velocity, but the tank is incredibly slow. It's got a very long reload. It's basically just annoying to play, but it's still a pretty decent backup. Then I have the T69-2G. This is the Bangladeshi tank. Again, I think they've actually removed this from the game. I don't think you can buy it anymore. This was the original replacement to the T62, but then they realised this was shit as well. It's got an upgraded APDS round, 351mm of penetration. No thermals, same high explosive proximity fuse. It's alright, not amazing though. Basically just a T55 that has been modernised quite a bit. Like I said, they did remove it because it was so shit, and they replaced it with the ZTZ-96A. Now this tank is a more modern top tier premium compared to the other premiums in the Chinese tech tree. Do have a pretty nice premium round, the 125/1. This is 466mm of penetration and a very high muzzle velocity. We also have high resolution thermal imaging, just like the WMA. So our battery rating 9.7, it is a fairly effective tank. We do have quite a reduced lineup though. We have the other ZTZ-96A. Have the ZLT, which is pretty bad. This thing, which is pretty atrocious. Then we kind of just don't really have any other backup. So I would say for a newer play, if you don't want to grind the Chinese tech tree, then the WMA is probably the best one to buy and just grind out all these tanks around here. It's much more effective. The ZTZ, it might be better when the Chinese get more vehicles added and they buff out the top tier lineup a bit more. This obviously is better bang for buck though, so if you can only afford one, it might be better with just this one, but the WMA by far has a better lineup. All that being said, let's get into the Italians. Alright, welcome to Italy. Like the other nations, the first few premiums aren't really worth it. They're just kind of funky looking. This thing's in unlisted and it's pretty atrocious. The Soleri Sarihano, it's pretty small to be honest. A lot of memes coming from it. It's quite funny looking. Not the most effective tank in the world. Pretty thin armor, sorry. Then I have the M14/41. Again, it's a Italian low tier premium tank, so it's not that good. The M4 hybrid is when things start getting turned around though. Battery rating 3.7 is fairly effective. Especially if you have the Panzer IV-G as well, these things together are very effective. The only downside is that the M4 hybrid is a rank 2, meaning it cannot be used to grind out events, which is a bit of a pain in the ass. Then also have the Zerini, which is a Hungarian vehicle. Basically it has Nebelwerfer things attached to it. Pretty decent little tank. You aren't really going to be using these though. The main weapon is going to be the main gun, obviously, which does have a pretty powerful gun. It's got a 75mm gun, basically just in basically a Hungarian Stug. Quite old fashioned, but still a bit of fun. It is battery rating 4.0 though, so it doesn't have the world's best lineup. 3.7 Italy is pretty decent. This thing did used to be 3.7 somehow, but now they've put it up to 5.0. You do also have the M4A4, as well as the M24, as well as this thing, which is very powerful. Can up tier it to 4.0 with the Stug and the Breeder, but the choice is yours. Pretty decent little vehicle. 3.7 Italy is pretty effective though. As you can see from my lineup, I play it quite a bit. We then move up to rank 4. I also cannot stand this tank at all. It's abysmal. Don't buy it. It's basically a M26 Pershing, but it's shit. Just don't get it. Then also have the M60A1 Ariete. Not sure if you can buy this anymore. This was quite a big controversy at the time. This thing used to have a gun stabilizer, but they removed it, which led to a lot of backlash. I think you can actually buy this for Golden Eagles, but I think it's nowhere near as good as it used to be. Don't buy it. The Orbal 74 high velocity gun. I think you can buy this on the store now. It has a 76mm gun, firing a sabot. It used to be pretty overpowered, to be honest. You could just drive around the battlefield shooting people with it, but they significantly nerfed the effectiveness of its AP FSDS round. Now it's pretty trash. Then going on to the last rank, the tier 6, we have the OF40. I believe this has now been removed from purchase, or it's available for Golden Eagles, I'm not too sure. It does have DM23, so it's fairly powerful. We have no thermal imaging. It's just not really that good. It has no armor to speak of whatsoever. Basically like a Leopard 2, there's just nothing really there apart from a bit of space armor on the side of the turret, not even in the front of it. So not really worth buying at all if you can buy it. Then have the VRCC, which is a Spanish vehicle, basically bought off the Italians. It's basically a Centauro. Do have DM33 rounds, which are very powerful, as well as very high resolution thermal imaging for the gunner and commander's sights, I believe. This tank is pretty powerful. At battery rating 9.0, we do have quite a good lineup for it. We have the VCC, the 105, the regular Centauro. They've up-tiered the Dado, but we do also have the Leopard 1A5 as well. You do have quite a nice lineup. The only problem is that Italy just does not have a top tier lineup anymore. The Arietes are basically dead in the water, so I wouldn't even bother trying to grind them out. The Centauro 120 is pretty effective. I do really like it a lot, but it's not really that good to play the Italians, so I wouldn't really recommend buying any top tier premiums for them, to be honest. The VRCC is probably the best thing to pick. I do also like the Panther 4G and the M4 hybrid. Alright, welcome to France. We do have the H39 Cambrone, which is pretty awful, just don't even bother with it. The B12, which was a reward tank, I believe, maybe not. It's pretty effective at battery rating 2.7. Used to go very well with this thing, the LVT, but they've increased it up to 3.7 now, so it's pretty much dead. This thing has a 40mm Bofors gun with the M81A1, which is very, very powerful indeed. It's a good little tank. I like it a lot. The B12, it's pretty trolly as well. Not as good as it used to be, but it's basically like clubbing. You can just, it's like seal clubbing basically. Very, very good. Then also have the M13 M24. It's a French hull with a American turret on it. Pretty decent tank. I've never really thought to buy it though, because I've already passed 3.7 in the French tech tree. Do have M61, so it is pretty powerful. It's up to you whether you want to get it though, really. I think the next tanks are a lot more effective. The M41 FL10 is a Sherman hull with a oscillating turret on top of it. This tank is very funky looking, but it used to be one of the most overpowered premiums in the game. If we take a quick look at the ammunition, you can see that we basically just lol pen through the front of Tiger 1s and Panthers even. So it is a very effective tank. The EBR, I'm not sure you can actually get this apart from on the Guardian Marketplace, but it is very effective as well. Both of these tanks are very good. I would still recommend getting the M4A1. At 5.0 it doesn't have the best lineup anymore, but you can still take along the M4A4 as well as the French Jumbo if you really want to, as well as the ARL. In the next tier up, we have the Belle Delphine Panther thing. This thing's pretty good. Not really too much to say about it. Just like the T5 in the Soviet tech tree, it's just a French Panther. It's basically... Do I have that stupid camouflage? Yeah, I do have the stupid camouflage on it. That cancer camouflage. Anyway, this tank, it's a very, very effective grinder. You can still take along this tank with it as well. It's just a French Panther. There's not really too much to say about it. I play it a lot. It's good fun. The EBR 1963, it basically trades all the good things about this EBR with really bad. This thing has a high explosive anti-tank warhead now, which does give it better penetration, but I think its firepower is a lot worse. I don't really like it at all. Then have the Sommoir SM. This is a very good premium. It's quite trolly, to be honest. The hull armor is very good. See here, we've got 150mm thick, and when it's angled, it's around 240. The weak point of the tank, though, is the turret here. It's very, very flat. It's only 40mm thick. As you can see, around into here, and basically your entire ammunition is gone, as well as the tank's gone. The tank is rather average when it comes to its mobility. The armor is pretty decent, at least on the hull, and the firepower is fantastic if I remember correctly. A 100mm gun giving you over 270mm of penetration. It's a very, very good tank, especially at battery rating 7.3. You can take along the EBR if you have it, as well as the Sunwa, and the other type of tanks around it, as well as the Char 25T. That thing got buffed massively in the last couple of updates. And that's pretty much it for the good parts of the French tech tree. Things only get worse from here. We have the AMX-30, which does not have a stabilizer at battle rating 7.7. We also only have a really bad type of high explosive anti-tank, so I can't recommend this at all. It's a terrible tank, and it's definitely not worth any money. Definitely not worth 7,500 golden eagles. We then have the AMX-30 Super, which arguably did used to be one of the best tanks in the game back in the day. This was the only French tank that had a thermal imager at one point, as you can see here. We do have the OFL 105F1 with 361mm of penetration, but it's just not that good. The tank is fairly slow. If you want to try and turn, the tank loses all of its speed. While it is fairly fast in a straight line, it just doesn't really like turning at all. As soon as you press the A or the D key, it just basically stalls the engine and you just come to a complete stop. The armor also is pretty bad. Don't really have any armor whatsoever. The reload speed is also pretty slow, and it's kind of just like one of those French vehicles that just doesn't really... It's just the definition of average, if you know what I'm saying. It's just not really that good. At 9.0 as well, you don't really have a lineup. The French tech tree is either 8.3 or 9.3 plus, so it's pretty dead in the water. What the French need is a good 9.7 or 10.0 premium grinder, like an AMX-40 premium, something like that. But yeah, I can't really recommend any of the premiums in the Swedish tech... Excuse me. I can't really recommend any of the premiums in the French tech tree, apart from the Panther Dauphine, maybe the Sommoir. Alright, so Sweden, we start with the SDRV M39. Not really worth it in my opinion, again, like pretty much every other tank. But then have the Panzerbill M40, quite a funky looking tank. Again, not really worth it in my opinion. Then move on to the SDRV M41S-1. Again, not really worth it. Then have the IKV-73, which is kind of a funky tank. I believe this was a Battle Pass award a few years ago. Again, not particularly that effective. This is really the major weak spot of the Swedish tech tree, is at the beginning first grind is just abysmal. Until you get up to like rank 5, and then it actually gets pretty good. Same thing for the SAV 2012-48 though. I'm not sure if you can actually get this anymore. This basically has a very high power autoloader, which can allow you to dump out a shitload of firepower very, very quickly. But it's just not really worth it. Then move on to the SDRV-81, which I spoke about in the British tech tree. This thing is very, very good. You also have a lineup with the SDRV-81, as well as the 101, the USH, and the UDES and the 103A. It's a very, very good tank. You do also have the 3 SAKO missiles on the side, but also get a nice new camouflage as well. It's not the world's most effective premium, but it is very, very good. Very, very good ammunition, you can see here with the Sabo and the solid shot. Probably the best premium that you can get for Sweden, at least low tier. Definitely better than this thing, the SDRV 103. This is the wedge, the cheese wedge thing. It looks good on paper, got very, very good high penetration rounds, but the thing just doesn't turn. These tanks aim basically with your mouse cursor and it just doesn't work. So just do not get it. It just does not work. We then have the CV90-105, which is the updated CV. It's a very, very good tank. It's arguably one of the best premiums in the game at the minute. We've got a very good DM33 round with 408mm of penetration, as well as a Scout UAV and 3rd generation thermal imaging, as well as a laser warning receiver and a laser warning sight. So this is a very, very good tank. Probably one of my favourite premiums currently in the game. We do also have a new premium, the Leopard 1A5 Norway, the Norwegian. This also has DM33 I believe, so you have the same firepower as the CV90, but you don't have as good, basically, gun handle. Excuse me, you don't have as good gun handling. This tank does not get the 3rd generation thermal imaging. It only gets generation 1, so it's a little bit weaker in my opinion. The tank is also much slower, and while it does have slightly better armor, that doesn't really matter. It's not enough to make a difference in my opinion. So in general, the tank is much weaker than the CV90-105. But as you'd expect, it is a lower battle rating, so it's kind of a trade-off what you think's best. I think the CV90 is by far the better choice in my opinion. It has a much better lineup. It is 9.7, but you can take it to 10.0 with the Bill, the 121, the 105, the 904OC. It's also just a good backup, even at top tier, I believe. I don't have it in my lineup because it's so packed, but I have it in my 10.0 lineup. And you can use it pretty much anywhere you want, really. It's a very good tank. I'd take this tank, really. I'd say that this premium is probably one of the best in the game at the minute. But yeah, it's your choice. I'd say this is better than this, but that's just me. Alright boys, to end this very, very long video, we've got Israel. Starting with the M51, this is one of the Super Shermans. You basically have a French gun with the French ammunition. It's got 400mm of penetration, which is impressive. The post-pen damage though isn't amazing in my opinion. It is fairly reliable. You can get quite a lot of work done with it, but it's not amazing. You are only going to be able to use it to grind up to rank 5 though. And to be honest, the Israeli tech tree isn't particularly great in my opinion. It's pretty lackluster. We then move on to the Magak 3. This is the exact same tank that was found in the American tech tree before they moved it over. For the price of 8,500 Golden Eagles. It's a very, very big ask. You can use it to grind up to battle rating 10.0, I guess, but I'd still say it isn't really worth it. The Israeli 7.7 lineup is pretty bad in my opinion, to be honest. Not really worth it at all. We then also have the Shot Caudilette, the same tank that's found in the British tech tree, but they just moved it over to the Israeli one. You also have the same ammunition, the M111. So it's not really worth it in my opinion. 8.3 for Israel is also pretty weak. You have some of the Magaks and the Shot Calv Gimel. Basically the exact same tank. Where Israel does start to get better though is the Makava Mark II-D. This was recently buffed. You now have the M413 shell, which is basically like the M33. It's a Makava Mark II, so it does have pretty good survivability. It is a little bit funky looking. Take a look in the X-ray, we can see that the tank is fairly well protected from the front. There's a lot of spaced armor and the engine does eat up a lot of shots. But from the side of the hull, you can kill the crew pretty easily. Kind of like an early Abrams where you kind of have to choose between disabling the gun and killing the crew. Can't really do both. So to be honest lads, I wouldn't really recommend getting any of the premiums in the Israeli tech tree. There's nothing really worth grinding in my opinion. Anyway lads, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's been quite a long one, but I can't really narrow it down any more than this. It's just me speaking, giving my opinion. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. And if you have any video ideas, be sure to let me know down below in the comments. Thank you and goodbye.